This episode contains discussion of real-world violence, including murder and assault. It is explored with care, but some listeners may find it difficult. Please take care whilst listening. By the late 1970s, as attacks continued and public pressure surrounding the Yorkshire Ripper investigation intensified, fear had existed long enough that people no longer simply wanted answers. Emotionally, they needed them. And that distinction matters. Because prolonged uncertainty changes the way that human beings think, interpret information, and respond to pressure. At first, uncertainty creates vigilance. But over time, vigilance becomes emotionally exhausting. And once emotional exhaustion takes hold, the need for certainty can begin outweighing people's ability to comfortably tolerate ambiguity. Human beings struggle with unresolved tension. We seek explanation, patterns, conclusions capable of restoring emotional predictability to situations that no longer feel understandable or emotionally safe. And the longer uncertainty continues, the stronger that pressure becomes. By now, pressure surrounding the Yorkshire Ripper case was no longer simply investigative. It had become social, institutional, psychological. And emotionally prolonged pressure changes behaviour in ways that are not always immediately visible whilst people are living through them. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have your company. I'm Jenny. I love history, and I am fascinated by the moments where human psychology collides with it in the worst possible ways. This is Hidden Chronicles. Season 3, The Yorkshire Ripper. Episode 7, The Pressure to Understand. As the investigation continued, pressure surrounding the case intensified from multiple directions at once. The public wanted reassurance. Communities wanted safety. The media wanted explanation. And investigators were now operating inside an atmosphere shaped not only by urgency, but by sustained emotional strain. Because by this point, fear had become deeply embedded within public awareness. And prolonged fear changes the relationship people have with uncertainty itself. At first, uncertainty can feel temporary, something waiting to be resolved. But when uncertainty continues for long enough, without clear resolution, people begin emotionally experiencing it differently. Patience weakens. Frustration increases. The emotional tolerance people have for ambiguity begins narrowing over time. And that narrowing matters, because human beings become more vulnerable to rigid thinking under prolonged pressure. The stronger the emotional need for certainty becomes, the harder it can become to remain fully open to complexity, contradiction, or ambiguity. By now, the scale of the investigation had expanded significantly. Police forces were under growing pressure to identify patterns, establish links between attacks, and reassure increasingly frightened communities that progress was being made. And importantly, the investigation was no longer unfolding quietly in the background. It had become highly visible, publicly scrutinised, repeatedly discussed, and emotionally charged. That visibility matters because investigations do not take place inside emotionally neutral environments. They unfold inside expectation, inside criticism, inside pressure created by repeated violence continuing despite ongoing investigative effort. And prolonged unresolved effort can become exhausting, institutionally as well as individually. Because we as human beings rely heavily upon progress in order to maintain confidence in what we are doing. We need reassurance that action is producing movement, that understanding is increasing, that uncertainty is narrowing. But in cases like this, uncertainty often continues, existing despite enormous effort to eliminate it. And emotionally, that can create a huge strain. In 1979, Barbara Leach was killed. She was 20 years old. And again, it is important to pause before allowing the structure of the investigation to overshadow the individuality of the life at the centre of it. Because behind public reporting, police appeals, and growing media attention, there existed a person whose life extended far beyond the violence that later connected her to this case. A life shaped by ordinary routines, relationships, ambitions, friendships, and experiences that mattered independently of the public narrative that followed. And by this stage in the investigation, repeated violence was beginning to reshape the emotional perception publicly in profound ways. Because repeated exposure to fear changes how human beings interpret ordinary life. People become more alert, more cautious, more emotionally sensitive to potential threat. And heightened alertness sustained over long periods of time can become deeply exhausting. Because hypervigilance requires constant anticipation, constant monitoring, constant emotional negotiation between caution and ordinary functioning. And human beings are not naturally designed to sustain that level of emotional alertness indefinitely without consequence. At the same time, media attention surrounding the case continued intensifying. And repeated exposure matters. Because the more frequently people encounter violence through headlines, broadcasts, discussion, and public conversation, the more emotionally present that fear becomes within ordinary thought itself. People were no longer simply hearing about isolated incidents. They were hearing repeated narratives connected to danger, uncertainty, and vulnerability over extended periods of time. And repetition reinforces emotional atmosphere. The more frequently fear is encountered, the easier it becomes for that fear to feel embedded within everyday life itself. And importantly, media does not simply communicate information. It shapes emotional perception. It influences what people focus on, what they remember, what they fear. And repeated focus on threat gradually alters the emotional texture of public life itself. One of the most important aspects of this stage in the case is understanding how powerful the need for certainty had become. Because uncertainty is difficult to tolerate for prolonged periods of time. As human beings, we naturally seek closure, explanations, conclusions that are capable of restoring emotional order to situations that no longer feel predictable or understandable. And once that emotional need becomes strong enough, interpretation itself can begin narrowing under pressure. People begin searching not only for answers, but for relief from uncertainty itself. And that distinction matters. Because the stronger the emotional need for certainty becomes, the greater the risk that complexity begins feeling intolerable. That does not mean people stop thinking carefully, but it does mean prolonged emotional strain can begin influencing how information is interpreted, prioritised, and emotionally processed over time. Looking back, it can be tempting to imagine investigations as purely rational processes, unfolding independently from emotion. But in reality, investigations occur within human environments, and human beings are affected by fear, by pressure, by exhaustion, by urgency, and by the emotional need for uncertainty to finally end. And by this stage in the Yorkshire Ripper case, that emotional pressure had become impossible to separate from the wider atmosphere surrounding the investigation itself. Because prolonged fear does not only affect individuals. Over time, it reshapes institutions, perceptions, and public emotional life collectively. Before we close, it is important to take a moment. A moment to step away from fear, investigation, media attention, and analysis, and return to the people at the centre of it. Barbara Leach. Like the others discussed throughout the series, She was far more than the circumstances that later connected her to public memory. She was a person with relationships, experiences, ambitions, routines, and a future that existed independently of this case. And recognising and remembering that matters. Because without recognition, it becomes too easy to focus only on investigation, escalation, or public fear, whilst losing sight of the people most deeply affected by them. In the next episode, we move further into one of the most significant developments in the case, examining how growing desperation for certainty would eventually create consequences that reshape the direction of the investigation itself. Thank you for listening. I'm really glad you joined me. If you're enjoying Hidden Chronicles, be sure to follow along so that you don't miss what comes next. As always, take care and be gentle with what history leaves behind.